Today I will be covering the results from the latest SCG Open. This is the Team Open, but for our purpose, since we're only looking at standard for MTG Arena, it doesn't really matter. What matters are the decks that finish in the top 8. There are a couple of things that I want to say before we get started. First off, remember these are best of 3 decks, and secondly, these are tournament decks, but they're also reactive to what happened last week. Usually, how it goes in a tournament is some decks will be previous week's best decks, some will be decks that are supposed to counter the previous week, some decks are decks that people think are gonna counter the counters to the previous week while still having a good matchup against the previous week. And then we have the fourth category, which is decks that are just consistent and will just plow through all competition. This is Gogari, or in this case, Sultai midrange. Again, the deck is just decent. Yes, it doesn't win every game, but it is one of those that just keeps on going, keeps on trucking, and that's all that you want if you're playing that type of deck. Let's get started. Now, as you can already tell from the list, there are quite a few control decks, and as per usual, we don't spend too much time talking about them because, well, they are kind of similar in the current meta. Again, if you look at it, there's nothing but removal spells, spot removals, we have a few counter spells, and win conditions. Teferi is there, maybe Delos Reborn, maybe you can go and grab something and kill them with their own creature. But apart from that, this list is very standard. Let's have a little bit of a look at the sideboard since we are moving into best of 3s. So the sideboard is not too interesting. We can see Hostage Takeover, we can see more counterspells, the 4 copies of Thief of Insanity. Now this card was actually featured in a lot of matches, and yeah, it's a really strong card. If it gets going, you can pretty much win the game outright. It is pretty much a curious obsession kind of deal. If it sticks too long, it pretty much wins the game for you. But overall, there's not too much to say about Esper's control. Let's move on to Nexus Reclamation, which is on play 7. Now, just as control decks, this deck is not too interesting. It is, well, if you haven't seen it already, it is using the Nexus of Fate together with Wildest Reclamation, which allows you to untap at the beginning of your end step, untap all lands you control, so you can do some funky stuff together with Nexus of Fate. Obviously, it's now running Teferi, it's running Search for Iskanta. It's not a very interesting deck to actually watch. It is, well, it's a bit frustrating to watch, and I'm not going to really waste much time talking about it. We could look at the sideboard a little bit. What we can see here is actually kind of a bit of everything. We have a few counter spells. We do have a lot of actually creatures here in Emma, which is kind of weird actually seeing Emma in here. But then again, she's a good creature if you get her to get her to stick, and you keep just tapping her, attacking with Nexus, blah blah blah. It can be quite annoying quite easily. Knight of Autumn is of course a really good tool card that can deal with a number of threats. Mainly the artifact and enchantments, which can be an issue if they actually get to stick, such as Legion's Landing and stuff like that. Anyway, let's move on. Now on place number 7, we're gonna see another Esper's control deck. Again, there's not much to talk about here, it's pretty much the same deal here. We see a mutable in this list, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. Like, okay, it's not the exactly same cards, but they do fill the same function, so it's not really much to talk about. This is your standard control deck. Obviously what Esper is really good at, especially now when we have things like Wrath at 4 mana, is of course to actually deal with the Gogari midrange decks, or the Sultai midrange decks. But overall, there's not much to talk about. This is your standard control deck. On place number 7, well, it's still the same deal. In this case, we can see there's actually 4 Thought Erasure in the main board. This card is of course amazing. You can take anything but a land and force it to be discarded, and you get to fix your next turn as well. But otherwise, your standard deal, 4 copies of Teferi now, And I guess that's the biggest thing to take away from these lists, are they are actually running 4 copies of Teferi Hero of Dominaria. Now, unlike last week, I actually did watch most of the standard matches. I did skip most of the modern because they are not that interesting. I did watch a bit of Legacy because that is always fun. I will talk a bit more about that as we come to a closure here. Now, place number 4, Esper's Control, Thought Erasure, Wrath. Again, we know what it does. Let's move on to number 3. So on number 3, we're gonna find Banned Token. Now this is basically an extension of the previous token deck, and what you have done now is basically, well, it has included the Hydroid Krasis. This card is probably the most splashable card for, like, forever in Standard. Like, if you can get away with running this, you run this. It's just that good. You can't really deal with the second effect, and it's just a very solid card. I actually opened up my 4th copy already of it, and yeah, the card is just fun. Now, I think Mono Red is probably the only deck and burn decks that are not actually looking at the Hydroid Krasis, but I think everyone else wish they can include it. Now, the Banned Token deck is basically an extension of the previous green-white token decks. We can see it's pretty much the same list. Obviously, the what is called a Daunted Vanguard has left the list to make place for the new Incubation Druid, as well as the Sapling Migration has left the list to make room for a Janis, and what else? There was something else I was gonna say. No, I think that's basically it. Those 2 are the cards that have left the banned token list from the previous version in the previous meta, and well, we've gone blue to get the Hydroid Krasis, and that's about it. Everything else pretty much stays the same. You can see there, March of the Multitude, Conclave Tribunal, History of Benalia, everything else is pretty much the same. Let's go and have a look at the sideboard. We can see some country spells because we are running blue, so you can actually fit them in now. Otherwise, there's just more good creatures here. Another Hydroid, Knight of Autumn, again really good against things like Legion's Landing. Actually, that is something that has actually been removed from this particular list, and that is the Legion's Landing. Although not all of the green-white token decks that I saw actually ran a Legion's Landing, but it was an option you could actually do. Anyway, we can see more counter spells, the 4th copy of the Hydroid, and a bit of removals. But that's about it. It's not a giant meta shift from the old decks in, what are we even calling it, in the previous standard. I mean, it's still the same standard, but with the previous card pool. But there's not a big upgrade. People are just trying to fit in the good cards, and that's basically it. Now, obviously, as time moves on, we are probably gonna see new decks and completely revamped list, but for now people are trying to stick with what is safe and what is actually working, such as Sultai Aggro. Obviously this is a Gogaria extension, and as we know, Hydroid Krasis is featured in it. Now this one is kind of interesting because we can only see 2 Hydroid Krasis. Most of the decks I've seen in Sultai Aggro actually runs the 4 copies. Now, there are 2 Hostage Taker in the main board, and I'm assuming that these replace the Hydroid Krasis. Now, one of the cards that I actually left the main board or overall the deck, or at least been reduced in number of copies, has actually been the Carnage Tyrant. Now, obviously, Carnage Tyrant is gonna lose a lot of value now that we actually have a Wrath spell at 4 mana. It makes it much harder to actually get a Carnage Tyrant on the field. Well, you can get him on the field, but it's very easy for control decks now to actually answer him. Obviously, Hydroid Krasis being so good, I can also see why you would remove the Carnage Tyrant for the Hydroid Krasis. It's a much safer card, and can keep bringing on the gas for the deck. But other than that, Sultai Aggro, pretty much the same as Gogaria was. Mainly the changes has been Carnage Tyrant either reduced in numbers or in the sideboard or out completely, and the Jellyfish Hydra Beast thingy moved into the main board. Now, interesting enough, this particular version actually had a single copy of the Ooze. Now I remember back in my Mythic video I did say that we would probably see a single copy of the Ooze in a Gogaria version of the deck just because, well, it's Gogaria, and in a late game setting the Ooze can be a backup win condition. It's not something you rely upon, but it's something that can easily take over the game. We are finally here to the deck that won the SCG Team Open Standard. Well, it was a team game, but you know, this was featured in the team that placed first, and that is the Winner White. Now, this deck is quite straightforward. We have our standard cards, the Vanguard, the Marshal, the Bodyguard, the Loxodon, and stuff like that. Conclave, History, Legions. Now, the interesting cards when it comes to the creatures are, of course, the 2 copies of the Deputy of Detention. Obviously, this is a spot removal on legs, and with a 3 toughness, it doesn't die to things like Cry, like Bolt, although red has been like kinda missing in action for some time now. Unless we're talking about goats. Well, not goats, rams, excuse me. I keep thinking that a ram is a goat, but as far as I can tell, a ram is a male sheep, it's not actually a goat. But people keep calling it a goat. Interesting. Anyway, let's move on. Now the rest of the deck is quite straightforward. We have our classics. Here is probably the newest card to join the list, and that is the Sentry. Obviously, with Sitting's Blessings and how easy it is to get Sitting's Blessings as mono white, this is a really good card to include. Now you would think that the Winner White would actually be quite bad against the number of Esper's control decks that are in the format, especially in this tournament. However, where is it? There it is. Legion's Landing is a extremely good card against Esper control because, well, it's very unlikely that they can counter it when you cast it. You want it on turn 1 against control decks, and once it gets flipped, it becomes just a nightmare. There was a hilarious moment on the tournament or on the stream where the Ajani got to ultimate and their control player had to deal with a stream of cats every single turn, and they ran out of cat tokens. It was actually quite fun to actually watch. It went on for some time. Now obviously Legion's Landing is an extremely strong card, and if you can resolve it and if it gets going and actually flips, it can quite easily take over the game. And obviously Teferi has a very hard time to actually deal with it once it's actually flipped. It's very easy to keep just pumping creatures, and it's unlikely that you actually are gonna get to the ultimate with Teferi. Like, yes, you might wrath the first couple of tokens, but after a while you will just get swarmed by tokens, and there's not much you can do, because one of the things Esper Control don't have is enchantment removal. They have hand destruction, but as a 1 mana cost, it's quite easy to get Legion's Landing on turn 1 and get it to stick. Anyway, let's have a quick look at the sideboard before we wrap this up. We can see 2 copies of Ajanis, a bunch of counter spells, and 3 copies of the Honor Guard, which is probably the most important card in this deck, especially against Sultai. Now what it does is preventing Explore from actually occurring, so all your Explore creatures just ends up as 2/1s. And as a 1/3, it is obviously outside of Moment of Craving and Cry as well. Overall, this card is really good. I would probably have gone with 4 and removed the island. I feel like that's a bit unnecessary to actually have the island, but otherwise, well, it's a good list. And that pretty much wraps up the top 8. Now there are a couple more things that I actually want to say before we go, and that is, first off, there were actually quite a few goat decks making it into, not goats, sheep, ram. A few ram decks that actually made it quite far, and there were a few black-white as well as red-black decks that actually made it quite far and was actually, you know, you would be able to take those decks into MTG Arena and do well with them. I just want to highlight it just so you don't think that now all of a sudden we're only gonna see Esper control decks and Weenie and Sultai. There was a quite diverse meta, but these were the decks that went the furthest. Words. Also do remember that as it is a team format this week, you could win every single game with your goat or ram deck, but your teammate might lose the modern or the legacy match, so you actually didn't go further even though you had a really good record with your standard deck. If you're not aware how the format works, then basically you have 3 people all playing simultaneously. One is playing legacy, one is playing modern, and one is playing standard, and obviously it's best of 3s, and well, when 2 people win, they move forward, or they don't move forward, they get their points, and once a round or a day is finished, well, the people that had the most points move to the next round. It is quite straightforward. But I just want to say that so you just don't think that we're just gonna see Esper control decks from now on. We're probably gonna see a different meta in the next week, which I'm really looking forward to. But that will pretty much do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will catch you next time. This is Project signing out.